We were just kids when we found the pumpkin patch hidden deep in the woods behind Old Man Halloway's farm. No one went there anymore, not since the accident that took his wife, or so the rumors went. The pumpkins grew wild now, their vines curling through the underbrush, their orange skins vibrant against the decay of the forest floor. Joey had dared me to go into the middle of it, right to the biggest pumpkin. It loomed above the others, its gnarled stem twisted like a claw reaching toward the sky. There was something odd about the way the pumpkin patch seemed to stretch on forever. I could see the edges of the forest from where I stood, but every time I moved forward, the distance felt farther. As I pushed through the vines, my footsteps grew silent, absorbed by the thick moss underfoot. Shadows began to stretch long over the patch, the last traces of daylight sinking beneath the horizon. My heart raced and I quickened my pace, eager to reach the center and prove to Joey that I wasn't scared. Then I saw it. She stood between the pumpkins, barely more than a silhouette at first, pale and thin, her face almost luminous in the twilight. Her hair hung in damp strands, clinging to her face as though she had just risen from the ground itself. I blinked, certain that my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I opened them again, she was closer, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to stare straight through me. I froze, unable to move, my legs locked in place. She didn't walk toward me, didn't float. She simply existed, one moment further away, the next impossibly near. Her hand lifted slightly, and though her fingers never touched me, I felt an icy cold run through my bones. The pumpkins around her seemed to pulse, their twisted vines tightening around their stalks. The light in the sky dimmed even more, the dusk quickly giving way to night, and still she stood there, her hollow gaze never wavering. Her mouth opened, though no sound escaped, and I realized that the strange whispers I'd been hearing weren't the wind in the trees. They were coming from her, a soft, broken murmur, as if she were calling for something, someone. The pumpkins began to change, their vibrant orange darkened, the smooth surfaces warping and splitting as if they were rotting from the inside out. Their jagged edges formed faces, twisted grins and hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the growing darkness. They seemed to turn toward me, their carved features leering, mocking my fear. I finally broke free of my trance and turned to run. But the path I had come down was gone. The vines had grown thicker, more tangled, blocking any way out. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled over the rough ground, my feet catching on the roots that now seemed to crawl across the soil like fingers reaching to pull me back. Behind me, I could still feel her presence. Even though I refused to look, I knew she was there, watching, following without moving. The pumpkins loomed larger now, their twisted faces flickering with the faintest light. The whispers grew louder, the cold wrapping tighter around me, suffocating. I ran, my limbs shaking as I pushed through the endless rows of gnarled pumpkins. The trees of the forest seemed to retreat further and further with each step, the safety of the woods always just out of reach. The pumpkin patch stretched on, unnatural, like a maze that had no exit. Finally, when I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled into a clearing. There, in the center of the patch, was the massive pumpkin. It was unlike any other, its surface cracked and blackened, the vines around it writhing as if alive. I could sense something within it, something ancient waiting. A shadow passed over me and I knew she was behind me. I couldn't see her, but I didn't have to. The chill wrapped around my body, the whispers now a constant hum in my ears. I sank to my knees, the ground beneath me soft as if it were opening up. I glanced back one last time, desperate for any sign of escape, but the pumpkins stared back, their grins wide and hungry. She was gone, but her presence lingered, woven into the very soil of the patch. The darkness closed in, and the last thing I saw was the pumpkins, their faces twisted in mockery, watching as I sank into the cold earth. Halloween night came, colder than usual, with a faint mist curling over the fields. I wasn't supposed to be out there, leading my younger brother through the Johnson Farms cornfield, but the shortcut was too tempting. The tall stalks stretched far into the distance, their brittle husks rustling softly in the night breeze. The path was narrow, cutting straight through the field toward the last house we hadn't visited. The scarecrow had always been there, a permanent fixture in the middle of the cornfield, standing watch with its tattered clothes and wide-brimmed hat. It never moved, just stood in its post with arms spread wide like a sentinel. But tonight, it didn't seem quite right. Its posture was different. It faced toward us rather than over the corn as it usually did. The sackcloth head was drooping slightly, the shadows under the brim deep, too deep to see inside. We walked past quickly, the sound of our steps muffled by the soft dirt beneath our shoes. As we moved further along the path, the corn rustled again, louder this time. I didn't want to look back, but something tugged at my mind. A feeling that I wasn't alone in the field anymore. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the scarecrow still perched where it always had been. It wasn't there. The spot where it had stood was empty, only a few tattered strands of hay left drifting in the night breeze. I blinked, hoping my eyes had deceived me, but the more I stared, the more certain I became. The scarecrow had left its place. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to keep moving, pulling my brother along with me. The rustling grew louder, now not just behind us but on both sides. The dry stalks shifted and swayed, though no wind stirred them. My mind raced, and I started walking faster. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, toward the edge of the field. The house at the far end of the road wasn't far, but the rows of corn seemed to stretch longer than they had before, the path narrowing as we moved. That's when I saw it, ahead of us now, standing in the path, barely visible through the mist. The scarecrow, arms still spread wide, straw limbs hanging from the old coat. Its sackcloth head was tilted slightly, and the hat sagged over what should have been empty space. The outline of its form looked different, more ragged, as though the fabric had begun to unravel. I swallowed hard and took a step back, bumping into my brother who had frozen behind me. The scarecrow hadn't moved, but it felt as if it had drawn closer, the outline of its shape becoming clearer in the dim light. The corn around us bent inward, closing us in, the stalks whispering as though alive. I kept my gaze fixed on the scarecrow, terrified that if I looked away, it would be standing right next to me when I turned back. The path stretched before us, twisting slightly in the moonlight. No longer the straight line it had been. The field, vast and endless, was swallowing us, and the scarecrow stood as if it had always been there, blocking the only way out. I could hear the dry rustling of the corn, faster now, like something moving between the stalks. There was a presence in the rows, watching from every direction. I took a step back, then another, dragging my brother with me as we began to retreat. But the scarecrow didn't disappear this time. Instead, it shifted, not with human movement, but in a way that made my stomach drop. The fabric around its limbs fluttered slightly, the straw beneath rustling as if it were alive. It didn't advance, but the sensation of being trapped was growing stronger with each second. It was as though the entire field had become a part of the scarecrow, its tendrils reaching through the soil, pulling us closer to its center. We turned and ran, the soft earth beneath us barely giving any traction. The corn whipped at our faces, the narrow rows tightening as if the stalks themselves were closing in. I tried to find the road, tried to find any sign of the way we had come, but the field had twisted around us and now there was no path, just endless rows of dry, yellowed stalks. Behind us, the rustling never stopped. I glanced back once, but the scarecrow wasn't standing in the path anymore. It was gone. My heart raced faster as I pushed forward, crashing through the corn, trying to ignore the feeling that something was right behind me. The road appeared suddenly, the tree line opening up in front of us. We scrambled onto the gravel, panting, hearts pounding in our chests. I dared one last glance at the cornfield before the mist swallowed it up. In the distance, at the very edge of the field, the scarecrow stood once again, arms wide, its sackcloth face turned in our direction, its head tilted slightly, just enough to let me know it had been watching all along. The field beyond it seemed quiet now. The rustling faded to nothing. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't stay that way. It had seen us, and it wouldn't forget. We had heard the rumors about the pumpkin patch for years. Strange lights in the sky, crops wilting overnight, animals disappearing without a trace. No one talked about it openly, but the stories persisted. We were old enough to dismiss it all as superstition. Yet there was something about the abandoned patch that pulled us in. On Halloween night, we decided to go there, just for the thrill, just to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. The field was overgrown, wild vines twisting and curling over the ground, weaving through rows of pumpkins that hadn't been harvested in years. The pumpkins themselves seemed unusually large, their deep orange skins bruised and cracked in places. The vines felt wrong underfoot, too thick, too strong, like they had been growing for far longer than they should have. As we stepped further into the field, A low hum began to fill the air around us. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but as we ventured deeper, it grew louder. The sound seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating through the soil beneath our feet. It was almost as if the earth was alive with some hidden energy, pulsing beneath the surface, drawing us toward the heart of the patch. The sky above was clear, the stars sharp against the night, but as we neared the center of the field, a light suddenly appeared in the distance, piercing the darkness. At first I thought it might have been headlights from a distant car, or maybe the glow of a farmhouse we hadn't noticed. But the light grew, brighter and more intense, shining directly down onto the patch. There was no mistaking it. It came from above, too high for any human-made source. As the light flooded the field, the pumpkins began to tremble. Their large, round shapes shook as if disturbed by an unseen force. The vines twisted and writhed like snakes, pulling tighter around the roots, squeezing. One by one, the pumpkins split open with a wet, tearing sound, their insides spilling out not in seeds but in something far worse. Gray figures emerged from the broken shells, crawling out from the cracked husks like insects breaking free of a cocoon. Their skin was smooth, wet, gleaming in the harsh light. They moved on long, spindly limbs, their heads too large for their bodies, with massive black eyes that reflected the light above them. These creatures had been hidden within the pumpkins all along, lying dormant, waiting. We froze, unable to comprehend what we were seeing. The creatures made no sound, but the air seemed alive with that low hum, now more intense than ever. It felt as though the field itself was vibrating, the energy building with each second, and I could feel it in my chest, a deep, rhythmic pounding that grew louder with every heartbeat. The creatures moved among the pumpkins, pulling themselves free from their gnarled shells. Their heads turned, scanning the area, their dark eyes locking onto us. The light above grew brighter still, the sky now awash with an eerie, unnatural glow. It wasn't just one beam of light anymore. Multiple lights streaked through the sky, forming a grid over the patch, illuminating every inch of the field. Shadows stretched long across the ground, the vines twisting in the brilliant light like veins pulsing beneath the surface. As we began to run, the ground shifted beneath us. It wasn't just the vines anymore. The earth itself seemed to pulse, like something far beneath was awakening. My legs felt heavy, the ground beneath my feet pulling at me, slowing me down. The creatures followed, though they didn't run or give chase. They didn't need to. The lights above us began to converge, a beam of pure white sweeping across the field. As the beam passed over the pumpkins, they withered instantly, collapsing into piles of rotted flesh, their vibrant orange skins turning black and brittle. The vines shriveled and died in seconds, pulling back into the earth as if retreating from the light. The field, once teeming with life, was now barren, stripped bare by the force above. The ground beneath us trembled, and I stumbled, nearly falling as the light swept closer. In the distance, I could see it now, a ship, massive, hovering just above the treetops at the edge of the field. Its shape was indistinct, a silhouette against the brilliant light, but its presence was undeniable. The beams of light came from its underside, scanning the ground, pulling everything up toward it. I could feel the pull, a strange, unnatural force that seemed to grip my entire body, tugging me upward, though I was still on the ground. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the earth itself began to rise in small chunks, pieces of soil and debris lifting toward the ship. The creatures followed, their bodies drawn upward, floating effortlessly toward the light. The few pumpkins that hadn't split open were yanked from their roots, lifted into the sky, disappearing into the blinding white above. We ran faster, desperately trying to escape the pull of the light. The sky was filled with those beams now, stretching out in every direction, covering the field in an intricate web of light and shadow. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself forward, away from the ship, away from the creatures that now swarmed the air, their bodies rising slowly into the darkness. But no matter how far we ran, the pull never ceased. The lights continued to sweep across the field, relentless, unstoppable. The creatures floated higher, disappearing into the ship, their dark eyes watching us until they were swallowed by the light. The earth trembled one last time before everything went still. The lights vanished, the ship gone, and we were left standing in the middle of a field that had once been full of life, but now lay barren and empty. The pumpkins, the vines, the creatures, all of it taken. Only the scorched earth remained, the echoes of that terrible hum still ringing in my ears. We never spoke of it again, but I knew that whatever had happened in that field, whatever had been hidden beneath the soil, was not finished. Halloween night had always been quiet in our neighborhood. A few groups of kids would wander by, knocking on doors with their plastic pumpkins and store-bought costumes, but most people stuck to the main streets. Our house sat at the end of a long, winding road, away from the bustle, and we hardly got any visitors. That year was no different. The porch light was on, the bowl of candy ready, but the night had been calm, with only one or two knocks at the door. It was getting late when I saw them. I had been about to turn off the light when I noticed a group of trick-or-treaters coming down the road. There were 4 of them, walking in a tight line, their costumes barely visible in the shadow of the trees. From a distance, they looked like any other kids out late, the kind who pushed their luck to visit every house before the night was over. But something about the way they moved caught my eye. They approached slowly, their figures just barely illuminated by the dim glow of the street lamp at the corner. I could make out their costumes then, traditional ones, the kind you'd see in old Halloween postcards. One was dressed as a skeleton, its white bones standing out against the dark night. Another wore a witch's hat, pointed and tall, but the brim seemed too wide, covering most of the face beneath it. The third had on a simple ghost sheet, with 2 cut-out holes for eyes, the fabric swaying slightly as they moved. The last one, trailing just behind the others, was dressed as a scarecrow, the tattered clothes hanging loosely from the thin frame. They walked in perfect sync, their feet hitting the pavement without a sound. I waited for the usual noise that accompanied trick-or-treaters, the laughter, the chatter, but there was none, just the soft shuffle of their footsteps as they made their way toward my house. The porch light flickered as they stepped onto the path. The first of the group, the skeleton, moved ahead of the others, its hollow eyes locked onto the front door. I hadn't noticed before, but the costume didn't seem right. The bones weren't painted on. They looked real, almost too real. The witch followed, her face hidden beneath the wide brim of her hat. The ghost and the scarecrow stayed behind, watching from the foot of the driveway, their figures still in the shadows. I stepped back, uneasy now, but there was no reason to turn them away. It was Halloween after all. The skeleton reached the door first, raising a hand that seemed more bone than glove. The porch light flickered again, and I glanced up at the bulb, wondering if it was about to burn out. When I looked back down, they were all standing there, closer than they had been before. I hadn't seen them move, but they were there, lined up at the door, staring. The witch's hat shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something beneath it, something pale and wrong. The ghost sheet fluttered in the breeze, but it didn't move like fabric should. The scarecrow stood unnaturally still, its straw limbs jutting out at sharp angles, as though it had been twisted into place rather than sewn. I reached for the bowl of candy, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. They waited, silent and patient, as though time didn't matter to them. I held out the candy, expecting them to take it. But they didn't reach for it. They just stood there, watching, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The porch light flickered one last time and went out, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, everything was still, and I thought they were gone. But then the shadows shifted. I could hear the faintest whisper of movement, like leaves scraping across the pavement. I stepped back into the house, my heart racing, and fumbled for the switch to the indoor lights. When the light flickered on, I looked through the window again. They were standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the glow of the house lights, their figures half hidden in the darkness. The skeleton's bony hand hung at its side. The witch's hat cast a long shadow over her face, and the ghost and scarecrow were still just out of sight, their forms blending with the night. I waited, but they didn't come any closer. They simply watched, as if waiting for something more than candy. Their presence lingered long after they had moved away, and I found myself checking the windows more often, scanning the shadows for any sign of them returning. But they didn't come back, not that night. The next morning I went outside, trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that the trick-or-treaters had been just that, kids in costumes, nothing more. But as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something odd. The bowl of candy was still full, untouched, just as I had left it, but scattered across the steps were bits of straw, small and dry, as though something had brushed past them in the night. I looked up, and for a moment I thought I saw something at the end of the street, a figure in the distance, watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. leaving only the quiet road and the fading memory of those trick-or-treaters that weren't. I had always known about the attic, but it was the kind of place we didn't talk about. Growing up in that house, I learned early on that certain areas were best left alone. The attic was one of those places. The door to it was tucked away at the end of a long hallway, behind a small wooden panel. I rarely gave it a second thought, except on the rare occasion when I'd catch the door slightly ajar. The darkness beyond it, a quiet reminder that something was up there, waiting. The house had been in our family for generations, passed down through the years with its creaking floors and weathered walls. It was old, filled with the kind of history that clung to every corner, the kind of place where stories seemed to seep into the very wood itself. The attic had always been a mystery, though, a part of the house I had never dared to explore. One fall, not long after Halloween, the sound started. Faint at first, barely noticeable. I would be lying in bed, the wind rustling the leaves outside, and then there would be the softest creak above my head, like something shifting on its own. The first few times, I dismissed it as the house settling or a stray gust of wind, but the noise grew, more frequent, more distinct. It was always the same, a slow, steady scraping as if something was being dragged across the attic floor. The sounds came more often as the nights grew colder. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening as the faint creaking became more insistent, more rhythmic. It was as though someone, or something, was pacing up there, moving back and forth in the shadows just above my room. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, that the old house was simply playing tricks on me. But the unease grew with each passing night. One evening, after a particularly restless night of listening to the constant creaking, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was causing the noise. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread I couldn't shake, I made my way down the long hallway to the attic door. It had been years since I'd even looked at it, but the wooden panel seemed as worn and weathered as I remembered. The knob felt cold beneath my hand as I turned it, the door opening with a groan that seemed to echo through the house. The stairs leading up were narrow and steep, disappearing into the darkness above. The faint smell of dust and age drifted down from the attic, and for a moment I hesitated. But the sound, that soft, persistent scraping, came again, and I knew I couldn't turn back. I stepped onto the first stair, the wood creaking beneath my weight, and slowly made my way up. The attic was colder than the rest of the house. The flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing old trunks, broken furniture, and piles of forgotten belongings, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It was exactly what I had expected, but the sound was still there, coming from somewhere deeper in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I moved toward it, the beam of light trembling slightly in my hand. In the far corner of the attic, something shifted. I stopped, heart racing, straining to see what it was. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, just a glimpse. A shadow darting behind a stack of boxes. I took a step closer. The floorboards beneath me creaking loudly in the stillness. The sound came again, louder now, as if whatever was up here was no longer content to remain hidden. As I rounded the stack of boxes, the light fell on an old rocking chair, sitting alone in the far corner of the attic. It was old, the wood worn smooth from years of use, but it looked untouched, out of place among the forgotten relics surrounding it. The chair swayed gently back and forth, the soft creak of its wooden legs against the floor matching the sound that had been haunting me for weeks. I stared at it, frozen in place, as the chair continued to rock, slowly, on its own. The temperature seemed to drop even more, a chill settling into my bones. I could see my breath now, misting in the beam of the flashlight as I stood there, unable to look away from the chair. It creaked again, the rhythmic sway continuing, but there was no one sitting in it. No wind, no movement that could explain why it rocked. It was as if the chair itself was alive, moving with a purpose I couldn't understand. The sound shifted again, not from the chair this time, but from somewhere above me. I tilted the flashlight upward, the beam catching the rafters just as something darted out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest, the darkness above seeming to grow deeper, more impenetrable. I swept the light across the beams, but whatever had been there was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of movement in the dust. The rocking chair creaked again, and I felt it, something watching me, It was as if the attic itself was aware of my presence now, as though I had disturbed something that had been content to remain hidden. I backed away slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I kept my eyes on the chair. It continued to sway, back and forth, its motion steady, unhurried. There was a presence here, something more than just the objects forgotten in the attic's shadows. I descended the stairs quickly, the door slamming shut behind me with a force that rattled the frame. Back in the hallway, the house seemed almost too quiet now, the absence of the attic's noise more unsettling than the creaking had ever been. I stood there for a long moment, listening, waiting for something to follow me down, but the house remained still. That night, I lay awake, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the sound to return, but there was nothing. The attic had fallen silent, as if whatever had been there had retreated once more into the darkness. But the memory of the rocking chair, swaying in that cold, forgotten space, stayed with me. The quiet creak of its wooden legs, moving without reason, echoed in my mind long after the attic had gone still. In the days that followed, I avoided the attic, keeping the door tightly shut, as though that could keep whatever was up there from reaching the rest of the house. But even though the sound had stopped, I knew it was only a matter of time before it started again. The attic was waiting, and whatever was up there, whatever had been rocking that chair, wasn't finished. Halloween had always been my favorite night of the year. There was something about the way the streets buzzed with excitement, how children ran from house to house in their costumes, clutching their bags, hoping for more candy than the year before. I loved decorating my home, hanging orange and black lights, carving intricate faces into pumpkins, and watching as the neighborhood transformed into a scene straight out of a Halloween movie. That night started like any other. The sky darkened early, as it always did at the end of October, and the streets filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the occasional barking of a dog that had been spooked by a passing ghost or witch. My porch was decorated with carefully carved jack-o'-lanterns, flickering warmly against the night. I had a huge bowl of candy ready for the trick-or-treaters, and sat back, enjoying the steady stream of costumed kids ringing the bell. The night had started to wind down, and I figured the last few kids had already come and gone. The streets were quiet now, most houses dark with their porch lights turned off. I stood by the door, thinking about turning in for the night when I heard it, a soft, barely there knock. It wasn't the usual rapid-fire knocking of excited children, but slow and steady. I opened the door, expecting to see a final straggler, someone who had stayed out late. But instead, there were 3 kids standing at the bottom of the steps. They didn't look like the other trick-or-treaters I'd seen earlier in the evening. There was something different about them, something I couldn't quite place. One was dressed as a scarecrow, straw sticking out of the sleeves of a flannel shirt, a hat tilted low over its head. The other wore a crude alien mask, its large, vacant eyes reflecting the glow of the jack-o'-lanterns. The third had draped a sheet over itself like a ghost, but the edges were tattered and dirty, as though it had been dragged through the mud. They didn't move, didn't hold out their bags for candy. They just stood there, staring up at me. My hand hovered over the bowl of candy, unsure whether to hand it out or wait for them to say something. But they didn't speak. The scarecrow's head tilted slightly, as if trying to get a better look at me, and a strange chill crawled down my spine. I forced myself to drop a few pieces of candy into their bags, but still, they didn't react. They didn't run off like the other kids, excited to see what they'd gotten. They just stood there, silent, watching me. I waited for a moment, unsure of what to do, and when the staring became too much, I slowly closed the door. I stepped away from the door, uneasy. There was something about those kids, about their stillness, their silence, that gnawed at me. I peeked through the curtains, expecting to see them heading down the street to the next house, but they hadn't moved. They were still standing at the bottom of my porch steps, facing my door. The minutes passed, and they stayed there. I kept glancing out the window, hoping they would just walk away, but they didn't. The street was quiet, no other trick-or-treaters, no sound except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. The jack-o'-lanterns flickered weakly in the darkness, their carved faces now casting eerie shadows across the porch. After what felt like an eternity, the 3 figures finally turned. They didn't run, didn't skip off like the children from earlier in the night. Instead, they walked slowly down the street, disappearing into the night without so much as a glance back at my house. I locked the door and turned off the porch light, my unease lingering long after they had gone. But the strangeness didn't end there. Over the next few days, I noticed odd things around my house. The pumpkins on my porch, which had been perfectly fresh the night before, began to rot rapidly, their carved faces sagging and melting into grotesque shapes. The grass around my porch had turned brown and brittle, as though something had sucked the life out of it. It wasn't just the decorations that seemed to decay. I started finding straw scattered in odd places, on the porch, in the yard, even inside the house. At first I thought it was just remnants from the scarecrow costume one of the kids had worn, but there was too much of it, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Each night after Halloween I would hear soft knocking on the door again. At first I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the knocking continued, always the same, 3 slow, soft knocks. Every time I opened the door, no one was there. But once, late at night, I looked through the peephole and saw them again. The scarecrow, the alien, and the ghost, standing at the bottom of the steps, silent, still, waiting. I stopped answering the door after that. I tried to ignore the knocking, tried to convince myself that it was just some kids playing a prank. But each night they returned. And each night I felt their presence more and more, lingering just beyond the door. Halloween came and went, but those trick-or-treaters stayed with me, haunting my thoughts, my home. I don't know what they were or why they chose my house, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at trick-or-treating the same way again. The candy bowls and carved pumpkins will remain, but the joy I once felt on Halloween has been replaced with a sense of dread. And as the next Halloween approaches, I can't shake the feeling that they'll return once more, standing silently at my door, waiting. We'd always gone to the same pumpkin patch every October, my family and I. It was a tradition that dated back to when I was a child, and I always looked forward to it. The wide open fields, the rows upon rows of pumpkins, and the cool breeze of autumn cutting across the landscape. But last Halloween, the patch wasn't the same. Something had changed, though at first I couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't the pumpkins, though many of them seemed to have rotted prematurely, their skins warped and sunken. Nor was it the field, though it had grown darker, less inviting, as though the joy of the season had been drained from it. That day I found myself alone among the pumpkins, my family busy elsewhere. I wandered through the rows, searching for the perfect pumpkin to carve for Halloween. The deeper I walked into the patch, the fewer people I saw. Before long, it seemed as though I was the only one left in the field. The ground beneath my feet felt oddly soft, as if I was stepping on something more than dirt and grass. But I pushed the thought away, telling myself it was just my imagination. As I made my way further from the main path, I noticed the scarecrows. There were dozens of them, more than I remembered from previous years. Their burlap faces hung limp, stuffed with straw that peeked out from under their frayed hats. Their clothes, old and tattered, swayed in the breeze, creating a low, rustling sound that filled the space around me. They were just scarecrows, yet each one seemed twisted, their limbs bent at odd angles, their heads cocked in strange positions. At first I tried to ignore them, but as I walked deeper into the field, it became harder to avoid the feeling that they were watching me. Every time I passed one, I couldn't help but glance back, convinced its head had turned, ever so slightly, as though tracking my movements. The sensation wasn't strong at first, but with each step it grew more intense, like invisible eyes boring into my back. I quickened my pace, glancing around for my family, but they were nowhere to be found. The pumpkins around me were rotting in the soil, their once vibrant orange skins turning black and brown, some crumbling into mush under the weight of my footsteps. A sickly sweet smell hung in the air, the odor of decay and damp earth clinging to everything. It felt like the patch itself was dying, like the ground had given up, and the pumpkins had followed suit. The scarecrows stood silently along the rows, marking the boundaries of the field. I noticed now that many of them were different from the ones I had seen closer to the entrance. These were older, their faces less defined, the burlap stained with what looked like dark splotches. Some of their limbs were missing or had been replaced with crude sticks jutting out of their torsos at odd angles. One scarecrow in particular stood out. It was positioned at the very center of the patch, taller than the rest, its arms spread wide as though welcoming me, or warning me to stay away. Its head hung low, the burlap sack sagging, but I could swear I saw something gleaming beneath the tattered fabric. I forced myself to turn away, trying to find the exit, but the field seemed to stretch on forever, the rows of pumpkins and scarecrows blending together in the fading light. The patch that had once been so familiar now felt like a maze, one I wasn't sure I could escape from. I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn brought me face to face with another scarecrow, each one more twisted and grotesque than the last. Some had faces barely stitched together, the burlap pulling apart at the seams, revealing bits of straw and earth beneath. A low, steady creaking filled the air. It sounded like the wind pushing the scarecrow's wooden frames back and forth, but the wind had died down, and the scarecrows weren't moving. The noise came from all around me, a grinding, rasping sound, like wood rubbing against wood. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it grew louder the further I walked. I started to notice things among the pumpkins, odd shapes, half buried in the soil. I assumed they were broken pumpkins at first, but when I bent down to get a closer look, I saw they weren't. They were fragments of old, discarded scarecrows, pieces of burlap, straw, and wood, all decomposing along with the pumpkins. Some of them were unrecognizable, rotted beyond repair, but others looked as though they had only been torn apart recently, their materials still relatively fresh. I straightened up quickly, my heart racing now. The scarecrows that still stood seemed closer, though I hadn't seen any move. Their faces, stitched into crude grins, seemed to mock me as I stumbled through the patch, trying to find my way out. The farther I walked, the more the field seemed to close in around me, the pumpkins rotting faster as I passed by, sinking into the dirt like bodies being swallowed by the earth. I finally reached the edge of the patch, my breath coming in short gasps. The path that led back to the parking lot was just ahead, but as I turned to take one last glance at the field, I saw the scarecrow in the center again. It stood tall, arms still outstretched, head still low. But this time I was certain its head had lifted, ever so slightly, and its face wasn't the blank, stitched burlap I'd seen before. Something dark and gleaming stared back at me from beneath the sagging fabric, and as I watched, the scarecrow's arms seemed to shift as if it had been holding them just a little too stiffly. I ran the rest of the way, not daring to look back again. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the door locked and the engine running. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the scarecrows were watching, standing motionless in the field, waiting for something, or someone. I haven't been back to the pumpkin patch since that day, and I don't plan to. Whatever lurks in those fields, among the rotting pumpkins and forgotten scarecrows, isn't something I want to face again. It was just supposed to be another Halloween, a quiet night in the countryside. My friends had planned a small bonfire in the middle of a clearing surrounded by trees far enough from town that we wouldn't be disturbed. I wasn't much of a Halloween enthusiast, but I enjoyed the company, the cool fall breeze, and the crackle of a fire under a starry sky. That night, however, would change everything I thought I knew about the world. The fire flickered in the clearing, casting eerie shadows on the trees that encircled us. The night was darker than usual, the stars hidden behind a veil of cloud cover. Even the moon barely managed to break through. My friends and I sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows, telling spooky stories, the typical Halloween night. The only light came from the fire, which seemed smaller and dimmer than usual, but none of us cared. The isolation had a way of amplifying the little things. The sounds of leaves rustling, the far-off hoot of an owl, the crackle of the flames. At some point, I got up to stretch my legs and stepped away from the warmth of the fire, looking out into the vast dark that surrounded us. The quiet was thick, broken only by the occasional pop of the fire behind me. It was peaceful at first, but as I stared out into the darkened woods, something flickered in the corner of my eye. I blinked, unsure if I had seen it, but there it was again. A light, far off in the distance, faint but undeniably there. It hovered just above the treetops, a soft bluish glow that pulsed in a way that no star or plane ever could. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the light seemed to stay just on the edge of my vision, teasing me. It wasn't a single light, I realized, but several, moving in a strange, rhythmic pattern. I called out to my friends, pointing it out, but none of them could see what I was talking about. They laughed it off as me trying to scare them, as though I had concocted a story to fit the mood of the evening. But the lights were real. I knew what I saw. The longer I watched, the more the lights began to shift. At first they moved slowly, circling above the trees, but then they began to dart in odd angular patterns, zipping back and forth almost too fast for my eyes to follow. It was like nothing I had ever seen. They weren't moving like helicopters or planes. They seemed alive, as if they had a mind of their own, and the way they danced in the sky sent a chill through me. I told myself it was just some strange atmospheric phenomenon, maybe drones or some sort of trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. These lights weren't anything from this world. The way they blinked in and out, shifting shapes and patterns, it was unnatural. I backed away from the edge of the clearing, retreating toward the fire, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the lights. As I watched, one of the lights broke away from the rest. It hovered above the tree line for a moment, pulsing softly, before dropping lower, closer to the ground. The trees obscured part of it, but I could still see its glow flickering through the branches, illuminating the tops of the trees in an eerie blue. It was getting closer, inching its way toward us, and my stomach knotted with unease. The others, finally noticing my silence, turned to look at me. But by then it was too late. The light was upon us. It moved soundlessly, gliding just above the clearing, the edges of its glow creeping across the ground, lighting up the fallen leaves in an otherworldly hue. I had never seen anything so unnerving. It didn't belong here, that much was certain. The fire dimmed as the light passed overhead, casting everything in a strange, ethereal glow. The flames, which had burned so brightly just moments before, sputtered weakly as if the very presence of the light was draining their energy. I felt frozen, unable to move, unable to comprehend what was happening. The light wasn't like a spotlight or a headlamp. It seemed to pulse with its own life, casting a glow that seeped into the trees, the grass, and the sky itself. The other lights, which had hovered in the distance, began to close in now, circling above the treetops like predatory birds. Their movements grew sharper, more purposeful, as if they had found what they were looking for. The soft whirring sound filled the clearing, just barely audible but unmistakable. It was a low, pulsing hum that vibrated through the ground, through my bones. My friends had stopped talking altogether, their laughter replaced by a tense silence as they, too, stared up at the lights. Suddenly, the light overhead shot back up into the sky, joining the others in a flash. They darted around wildly, zigzagging through the sky with impossible speed. The trees rustled as the wind kicked up, leaves swirling around us as the lights twisted and turned above. It was as if they were communicating with each other, though not in any way I could understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were scanning us, watching us, and whatever they were doing, it wasn't for our benefit. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights shot off into the distance. In seconds, they were gone, vanishing beyond the horizon, leaving behind nothing but silence. The clearing was plunged into darkness once again, the fire crackling weakly at our feet. The world seemed to stand still for a moment, as if reality was struggling to return to normal. The others muttered nervously, trying to rationalize what had just happened, but I couldn't. There was no rational explanation for what we had seen. Those lights, those things, had come from somewhere else, somewhere far beyond our understanding. They had hovered above us, watched us, and then disappeared without a trace. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We didn't talk much after that. Didn't joke or laugh the way we had before. The excitement of Halloween was gone, replaced by a quiet, lingering dread that none of us could shake. As we packed up to leave, I kept glancing back at the trees, half expecting to see those lights again, hovering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to return. I don't go out to the woods much anymore, especially not at night. Even now, months later, I can still see the lights in my mind, twisting and darting through the sky, their strange alien glow illuminating the world in a way that no human-made light ever could. And sometimes, on especially dark nights, I'll look up at the sky and wonder, are they still out there watching us from the stars? Every Halloween, the scarecrows went up across town. You could see them everywhere, propped in fields and front yards, their hollow eyes watching over the festivities. Most were harmless, the usual burlap sacks stuffed with hay, meant to scare off crows and give the place a spooky autumn feel. But there was one scarecrow, out in the middle of an abandoned cornfield on the outskirts of town, that no one dared to go near. Its eyes, glass, or at least something that looked like glass, seemed too real, too human. They watched, not just the crows, but anyone who passed by, following them with an unnatural intensity. It was old, ragged, and unlike the festive scarecrows decorating front lawns, this one looked forgotten. Its clothes were faded and torn, its straw stuffing bulging through gaps in the fabric. But those eyes, set deep into the burlap face, were pristine. They never seemed to fade or crack like the rest of the scarecrow. Instead, they remained bright, shiny, and unnervingly focused. Every fall, I'd see it when I rode my bike to school. I tried not to look directly at it, tried to keep my focus straight ahead, but its eyes were always there, staring back at me as I passed. It was as though it was waiting for something, some reason to move from its post in the field. No one else seemed bothered by it, or maybe they just pretended it wasn't there, buried in the rows of dead corn that had long since stopped growing. This year, curiosity got the best of me. It was a few days before Halloween, and after hearing the stories from the older kids about how no one had ever touched the scarecrow, I decided I would. I had never seen anyone go near it, not even the farmers or the town workers who maintained the roads around the field. And despite the passing years, despite countless storms, the scarecrow stood in the same spot, unchanged except for the wear on its clothes. I rode my bike out to the field just as the sun was setting. The sky was turning a dusky orange, casting long shadows across the rows of cornstalks, most of them bent and broken from neglect. I stopped at the edge of the field and looked out at the scarecrow, standing about 50 yards away, its silhouette dark against the fading light. I could already feel its eyes on me. I wanted to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. I stepped off my bike and took a deep breath before walking into the field. The cornstalks rattled around me as I pushed my way through, their dry husks brushing against my arms. I kept my eyes on the scarecrow, watching as it grew larger with every step. Its face became clearer, the burlap sagging under the weight of its stuffing, its mouth stitched into a crooked line. But those eyes, they shone even brighter as I approached, reflecting the dying light of the sun. Up close, the scarecrow was taller than I expected, towering over me with its long wooden frame. Its clothes were frayed, the sleeves dangling loosely from its stick arms. The patches on its overalls were worn thin, and straw poked out from its seams like it was bursting from within. But it was the eyes that held me in place. They looked almost like marbles, set deep into the fabric of its face, but there was something alive about them. They glistened with an unnatural brightness, as if they were filled with light, flickering slightly in the shadow of the cornfield. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing against the rough burlap of its chest. The scarecrow didn't move, of course. It was just an old, weather-beaten thing standing in the field. But as my hand lingered there, I felt a strange electric sensation run through my fingers, like static, making the hairs on my arm stand on end. The scarecrow's eyes seemed to brighten, almost imperceptibly, but enough that I took a step back, suddenly uneasy. I tried to pull my hand away, but the fabric clung to my skin, as though the scarecrow had grabbed hold of me. My fingers were stuck, caught in the rough burlap, and for a moment panic gripped me. The scarecrow's face was unchanged, its mouth still stitched in that crooked grin, but its eyes, those glassy, shining eyes, were no longer passive observers. They glowed with something I couldn't explain, a light that seemed to pulse in time with my own heartbeat. I yanked my hand free, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over the tangle of cornstalks. As I stepped back, the eyes followed me, shifting slightly in their sockets. The scarecrow hadn't moved. Its arms still hung at its sides, its body swaying slightly in the wind, but I could feel its gaze locked on me, more intense than ever. I glanced down at my hand, expecting to see some sign of what had just happened. Cuts, burns, anything, but there was nothing. My skin was untouched, though it tingled where the scarecrow's burlap had clung to me. I turned to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the scarecrow was watching my every step. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw the eyes again, glimmering in the twilight, tracking my retreat. They shone even in the growing darkness, twin points of light amidst the sea of shadows in the field. I felt like I was being pulled toward them, drawn back by some invisible force. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. I backed away slowly, feeling as though I was under its spell, the glow of its eyes burning into the back of my mind. When I finally broke free from the cornrows and stumbled back onto the road, I felt a rush of relief. I grabbed my bike and pedaled away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. But even as I rode away, I could still feel it, those eyes. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, my mind replaying the moment I had touched the scarecrow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, its hollow, stitched grin, and those gleaming eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a trick of my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I didn't go near the field again after that. I avoided the road entirely, taking longer routes to school just to keep away from the scarecrow's gaze. But I could never truly escape it. No matter where I went, I could feel its eyes on me, like they had left an imprint in my mind, forever watching. It was as though a part of me was still standing in that field, forever trapped under the gaze of the scarecrow's eyes, unable to look away. I've always loved Halloween. The crisp fall evenings, the carved pumpkins glowing on doorsteps, the thrill of dressing up and wandering the streets for candy. It's the one night of the year where the world feels magical, different, just a little bit dangerous. This year, though, Halloween felt strange in a way I couldn't explain. It started with the pumpkins. There was always a house in the neighborhood that went all out for Halloween, turning their front yard into a haunted display. Every year they had rows of perfectly carved jack-o'-lanterns lining the walkway, their faces flickering with candlelight, grinning in a way that was meant to be eerie but still playful. This year, the pumpkins looked different. I hadn't noticed it at first, but as I walked past the house, trick-or-treat bag in hand, something about them seemed off. Their faces weren't the usual simple grins or toothy smiles. Instead, they were contorted into strange, unnatural shapes. Wide mouths stretched too far, eyes that seemed too large and hollow, and expressions that twisted into something more sinister. Their glow was dimmer than normal, too, as though the candles inside them were struggling to stay lit, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. I stood there for a moment, staring at them, trying to shake off the sense of unease creeping over me. The pumpkins seemed almost alive in the dim light, their hollow eyes watching me as I passed. The longer I stared, the more I swore their expressions shifted, just slightly, as though the faces were molded by hands that had twisted them into something grotesque. I shook it off as an overactive imagination, convincing myself it was just part of the decorations. As I continued walking down the street, more pumpkins lined the paths of neighboring houses, but they all seemed wrong. They were carved too intricately, their faces too lifelike, as if someone had poured an unnatural amount of detail into making them look as grotesque as possible. Their eyes especially stood out, dark, hollow, and deep. Each one seemed to stare directly at me, tracking my movements as I passed by. I tried to focus on the fun of trick-or-treating, but every house I stopped at had more pumpkins. And with each new set of jack-o'-lanterns, the feeling grew stronger. Their faces were no longer playful or scary in the traditional sense. They were twisted as though frozen in some kind of agony. I tried to brush it off as just part of the season, the darker side of Halloween, but it was harder to ignore when they seemed to be staring right through me. By the time I reached the end of the block, I realized it wasn't just the pumpkins on that one house. Every pumpkin on every porch looked the same, deformed, their carved faces warped beyond recognition, eyes too wide, mouths gaping as if screaming in silence. I hadn't noticed it before, but the same strange expressions were on every one of them. No matter where I turned, I was met with those hollow eyes, watching, waiting. I hurried to the next house, eager to get my candy and move on. But when I reached the porch, I stopped cold. The jack-o'-lantern there had a face unlike any I had ever seen. Its grin was impossibly wide, stretching from one side of its sagging face to the other. Its eyes were set deep into the orange flesh. But there was something else about them, something that looked too real. They weren't just hollow holes cut out of the pumpkin. They looked wet, gleaming in the soft candlelight, as if they were watching me with some kind of awareness. The longer I looked, the more convinced I became that they were moving, following me with a slow, deliberate gaze. I backed away from the house, turning quickly onto the next street. But it was the same. Every house I passed had the same pumpkins, their faces more grotesque than the last. Some of them had twisted features, others seemed to slump in on themselves like they were rotting from the inside out. Their eyes, though, those hollow, lifeless eyes, they seemed to follow me no matter how fast I walked, tracking my every movement. As I reached the outskirts of the neighborhood, the pumpkins became more numerous, lining the edges of the streets, stacked on porches, and set in windowsills. Their flickering candles cast strange, shifting shadows that seemed to dance in the corners of my vision. I tried not to look too closely at any of them, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that they were watching, waiting. The carved expressions no longer seemed like decoration, but like warnings. I could hear the laughter of kids behind me, their voices carrying through the chilly night air. But the sound felt distant, as though I was walking through a different world entirely. My footsteps echoed too loudly on the pavement, and the streetlights cast a sickly glow over the rows of jack-o'-lanterns, their faces looming in the shadows. Ahead of me, the pumpkins lined the road, dozens of them, their faces illuminated by the dim, flickering glow of their candles. But the candles were barely visible anymore, just faint glimmers inside the pumpkins' hollow heads. They weren't glowing as they should, weren't lighting the path ahead of me. Instead, they seemed to absorb the light around them, casting an eerie gloom that made the shadows stretch long and deep. The further I walked, the more the pumpkins seemed to grow in size. They were no longer the small, round ones set neatly on porches. These were larger, misshapen, and grotesque. Their features twisted and warped, their eyes sunken and hollow, black as voids. Their expressions weren't playful or spooky. They were pained, mouths frozen in silent screams, as if something inside them had been trapped, unable to escape. I picked up my pace, my breath coming faster as I tried to shake off the unease building in my chest. But no matter how fast I walked, the pumpkins were there, staring at me, their hollow eyes reflecting the flicker of their dimming candles. They lined the edges of the street, rows of them, too many to count, and I couldn't help but feel as though they were growing in number, closing in from all sides. I finally reached the end of the road, my heart racing. The last house loomed in front of me, its porch bathed in the weak glow of a single jack-o'-lantern. But this one was different. It wasn't carved into a face like the others. Its surface was smooth, unmarked by any knife, but the top had been cut, the lid askew, and the candle inside flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the porch. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. There were no eyes, no twisted grin, no expression at all, but something about it felt worse than all the others. The candle inside flickered once, twice, and then went out, leaving me standing in the dark. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard a sound behind me, a soft rustling, like dried leaves brushing against each other. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew, without seeing, that the hollow eyes of the pumpkins were still watching, their carved faces grinning in the darkness, waiting for me to turn around.